Hey, it's part two. Sorry, the system hit right at 15 minutes and I had almost finished. So I just wanted to have a couple of closing thoughts about sources and all of that stuff before we wrap up. So a couple of things. You will notice that in my section two here so far, I have a grand total. Actually, if we take out that first paragraph, because that's just the introduction, but in my first perspective on the economic consequences of the Great Leap Forward, I have a grand total of 14 individual citations in this, just in this one paragraph. And if you count all of the individual sources, not the number of times they were cited, the individual numbers of sources, I have nine sources in the first paragraph alone. So I know that some of you are probably panicking and going, "Oh my gosh, how am I going to get 9, 10 sources? I can barely come up with five." And how am I supposed to, have enough room to cite all, 10,000 sources? And so really what I just want to go over is to say, don't panic. Right? Don't panic. It's not a huge deal. We're going to talk about some ways that you can increase the number of citations and by extension, the number of sources you're using in your paper. So I had said I wanted to see a bare minimum of like 9 to 10 sources. Preferably, you will probably have more. And again, to sort of allay some of those fears of how the heck am I supposed to get to 15 sources to meet that, or whatever it is to meet that range of source requirement for IB, because every IB examiner is going to be different. Well, the way that you're going to do that is to understand that, remember, the bulk of your research, the bulk of your cited material in section 2 should come from your two main sources that you evaluated in section 1. Right? So it should be about 40 to 50% of all cited material. What that means is if you're going to have 18 sources or whatever, let's say I'm trying to get you to that bare minimum of 10 sources. If two of them have to be the half of your material, well, then all that means is your remaining sources, you're each only quoting them 1 to 2 times, right? 3, maybe tops 3, right? Maybe 3 tops. And that's what you find here in this one paragraph. So if we look, starting at 5, right, because 5 is the start of my first perspective, Jonathan Fenby is quoted 3 times. Tony Syke is quoted once. Chow, who is the guy who is talking about the economic consequences of the Great Leap Forward, he has 1, 2, 3, 4 quotes in that paragraph. As I get closer to finishing, and I get a more complete sense of my word count, I might want to go back in and add some more evidence from his piece, because that is one of the sources that I evaluated in section 1. So I do need to make sure that I use it a lot. And so for me personally, an area that I probably might improve on is including more of his own opinions and his thoughts and his evidence, because again, he is from section 1. So I need to see a lot more of that. I also have one quote from Chang and Halliday. That was the helicopter that was detained at the border in Vietnam. I have Frank Decoder, who is primarily going to be used for talking about the demographic impacts in this IA, but he does still talk about consequences across the board. And so I thought it was appropriate to include one of his in there. So Kent Dang, I add one quote of his in there. Actually, no, sorry, that's 3. 3 of his quotes. And one from Alan Todd, the IB textbook. So you'll notice that my section 1 source has 4. It has the most. Everything else has anywhere from 1 to 3. Right? Just one to, and it was just that one kind of standout with Jonathan Fenby, who had 3. I guess Kent Dang had 3 as well. But a lot of these other sources, I'm just citing once. So if trying to get to 15 sources or even 10, if that terrifies you, just understand you only have to cite a source once for it to show up on your bibliography. You only have to cite it once for it to show up on your bibliography. So in that sense, it might actually be fairly simple to get to 15, 16, 17 sources, because I have 9 individual sources cited in my first 2 paragraphs. Actually, really in my first perspective, I've quoted actually Judith Shapiro, who's talking about the environmental consequences, right? So to this point, I have talked about 10 sources in 2 paragraphs. So in 678 words, I have cited 10 separate sources, and many of them I've only just cited once. And I have 2 more perspectives to get to. So hopefully you're able to see just how easy it is. And I'm not saying that you have to have 18 sources that are all cited 5 times. Right? Again, it just takes one source citation from a book or from an article or whatever to make it into your bibliography. So when you're getting, if I'm asking you to get to 10, and again, preferably you would probably have more if possible, you only have to cite it once. That's all. That's all you got to do, just one. And so remember that as you are working through and filling in the evidence, that the more evidence you are including from your sources, right, and less of your own thinking, the easier it's going to be to get those source citations and the sources in your bibliography. Which is why in some of the other I's that we've seen as practice that got 7s, that's why they're able to get 40, 50, 60 individual citations, because the only times that they're actually talking, they're only using their individual thoughts, is when they are doing things like questioning evidence, right? However, it should be noted that official statistics from the Chinese government should be viewed with skepticism, so on and so forth, right? The crappy goods that were being made in China during the Great Leap Forward, and sort of my own thoughts, right, that would clearly give China a poor reputation on the global stage, right, as a poor trading partner. And so my own thinking really is, if I were to just do a ballpark percentage, my thinking, my own thoughts without any paraphrasing or using evidence from my authors or my sources, it probably makes up about 15% of what I've written so far. It might get upwards of 20 to 25% when you take into account the conclusion, because you're not supposed to include any new evidence in your conclusion. But really, so 3/4 should be just cited material. It really should, right? And again, that will make your life easier if you're letting other people do the work for you, right? Because that's what you're doing. You're letting your sources do the talking, and all you're doing is just, writing down and paraphrasing what they're having to say, right? Another thing to take away, and this is sort of a way to increase the number of sources that you are able to use and put in your bibliography and in your citations, is if we go up to the beginning of my first perspective here, the statistics about the industrial and agricultural output and all that kind of stuff, that came from Alan Todd's book on the People's Republic of China from 49 to 2005. This is the IB textbook that we're going to use a little bit next year when we talk about the Great Leap Forward. But on page 108, which is where I cited, it's in here somewhere. Oh, actually, no, I didn't. And here's why. So when we listed these government statistics in this book, they list a number of data points with tables and charts, and you can't see it because I'm projecting what is on, what I'm looking at on my screen. But the sources that are listed in the book are not actually from Alan Todd. They are listed right here in the book. It says adapted from J. Fenby 2013, which, if that sounds familiar, it's because that's what's right here. Right, so Jonathan Fenby is the one who had the statistics, and even then, Jonathan Fenby probably got those statistics from the Chinese archives, right? And so the neat thing is, without actually having a physical copy of the book in my hands, I do not actually own a copy of this book. I do not have this book in my possession. Without actually having a copy of this, look at that. I've got 3 separate citations that I've been able to include in my research, and when I end up getting to my bibliography, that's an extra source that I can put in my bibliography. Because remember, when we are looking at the range of source requirement, which is what you need to be able to do in order to score 13 to 15 points, that's going to be how you do it. So any historian who considers themselves a professional, or at least they call themselves professional, if you flip to the back of the book, they are going to have a massive list of all of their citations that they used in their research. Frank Decoder's book, Mao's Great Famine, if we go to the back of the book, pages 349 to 404. So that's 55 pages. 55 pages this guy has of citations, of stuff from the Chinese archives and interviews with people that he did who lived in China, right? So if you see something in one of your texts as you're working, and it's got a citation and you want to use that in your text, right, or in your IA, go to the back of the book, find where he says that is, and then cite that, right? You don't actually have to have the book in your hands or that source in your hands to be able to cite it. Right now, there are some special rules about how you cite that in a bibliography, and that'll be some of the things that we go over as we get into formatting, right? As we get into the bibliography section of the IA, right? But it's a way for you to say, hey, I don't even have Jonathan Fenby's book. How do I get it in there? Okay, well, it's the data is listed in the book, in a separate book. So just put it in there, right? So that's going to be a pretty easy way for you to pad the count of your total number of sources. Because like I said, by the time I finish writing my section 2, I'm going to have like 16, 17, 18 sources total, which would very clearly meet that requirement of using a range of sources in the investigation. So just those are some things to keep in mind, right? So I want you to not be scared about having to include that many sources, right? Because I promise you, if you've done a lot of research, you will be able to easily just fill that stuff in, right? I actually had before I started submitting this work, I actually had 22 different citations. So I had to take 4 citations away because if you look just after the introduction and one perspective, I'm already at 678 words. Now, of course, that doesn't count, the titles, the headlines, the all of this, the footnotes. But remember, the section 2 should be about 1,300 words. So I actually had to cut back because I had too many sources, right? And too many sources is always better than not having enough sources, right? One of the things that will really get you dinged by IB examiners is when they say, when you only have 4 sources that you cited 13 times in your entire section 2, right? That is not enough sources, not even close, right? You have to have a lot more than 4 individual sources citing 13 times, because it's like 1 citation every 100 words, right? That's not really an investigation. You're kind of giving your own thoughts. And the purpose of the investigation is you aren't the one giving the information, right? Because remember, we talked about this before. You are a crime scene investigator who stumbled onto a murder scene, right? Your job is not to go onto the scene and say, I think Tom did it, and now I'm going to look for evidence as to why. Your job as the investigator is, okay, I've stumbled upon a crime scene. Somebody's been murdered. What does the evidence suggest, right? And so just let your evidence, let your sources do the vast majority of the talking for you, and I promise it's going to make your life so much easier. Okay, so we will continue talking about some more tips with section 2 later, especially as I continue to write my other 2 perspectives. So this weekend and early next week, as I come back to my classroom, I will start adding in some of these other perspectives, and we'll do some more work with that. Hopefully that helps. Like I said, if you don't get your work in by the deadline, if you give it to me a couple of days late, it's not a huge deal because we aren't doing our official schooling online until the 13th. So thanks. I hope this helps, and I will talk to you guys soon.